Appendix 1. The pre-flood earth. In order to help you understand the shape and nature of the earth and to bring it closer to your understanding, it is above all necessary to present to your mind the main mountain ranges of that time, both in Asia, Europe, and Africa, as if in a picture. Because of the many that have existed at that time, no trace can be found today. Partly they have been torn apart and washed away by the retreat of the sea, and their old connecting ridges are lying now buried deep beneath the stream debris of the valleys. And here and there, the currently existing streams and rivers must squeeze through the pinched-off mountains' narrow gorges. But as for the high mountains, they have, except for a few, been altered so much by the action of the different weather conditions that a person who lived only 1,000 years ago would now not that easily recognize them as the same, if he would be placed with his former consciousness where he had lived 1,000 years ago as a human being. One only has to take a closer look at the stony debris of a few hours wide river valley and consider the mass that occurs in it to a depth of 400 fathoms, which has been loosened by water in the area of the high mountains. From the origin of such a stream to its mouth at some sea, and one can easily understand that the mountains, only 2,000 to 3,000 years ago, had a very different shape than now. This preface was necessary for to understand more easily the pre-Noah geography of the mountains. We begin with the north of Europe, and then move over partly to Asia, and then to the southern parts of Europe, and then finally to Africa. From the mountains that stretch almost through the middle of Sweden and Norway, a strong mountain range in the extreme north went as far as the Urals and connected with them in an ever-increasing direction, and had a width of up to 100, even 200 German miles. This mountain range also connected with the present mountains of Denmark, and from there further with the mountain range that today still more or less separates Western flat Europe from the mountainous German Europe as far as Switzerland. And thus the Swiss mountains were connected with the Urals, and the Urals through Central Asia with High Tibet. This was, therefore, an uninterrupted ring of mountains, the lower parts of which still offered a height of between 5,000 and 6,000 feet above the surface of the sea. But they were not of the same consistency everywhere, and therefore, in the case of the Mediterranean seas, which still need to be described, which were not connected to the main sea at that time, they were broken through by the flooding and washed away in different directions. There were two main Mediterranean seas at that time. The northern Mediterranean consisted of a large basin stretching from today's Black Sea, in part over the whole European Russia, and all adjacent low-level countries up to the current Baltic Sea, and also to the lower parts of the current European Turkey, up to today's so-called Iron Gate, as well as the narrow passes at Belgrade and Semlin, which were reached by its mountain-high waves during large storms. This was therefore the northern Mediterranean. The second Mediterranean, which was not connected to the former, and still today carries the name Mediterranean Sea, had, just like the northern Mediterranean, no link with any oceans. But its surface was throughout, not smaller in size than that of the aforementioned black or northern one. The second Mediterranean covered the region of today's Fiume, where a broad and long valley stretches into Croatia, and from there further in different branches to the riverbed of the Sava, as far as Crane, and there up against those areas where the high mountains begin. On the other side it covered the current Venetian kingdom, as well as the area of Lombardy, and also some eastern parts of France. While in Africa, covering the Nile Valley, up to the cataracts, and also today's great sandy desert. From Asia, a significantly high mountain range existed of which still nowadays substantial remnants are present. This mountain range extended from the northeastern part of Africa to also the high cataracts, which further on are linked to today's high mountains of Africa. The Strait of Gibraltar was also connected to the present-day Spain, namely by a fairly high mountain range, and thus formed the second Mediterranean, which in size compared well with the northern Mediterranean. However, generally, it was lying many fathoms lower than the northern Mediterranean, of which the Black Sea today is still a remnant. Now there also existed a third Mediterranean. To determine the ancient locality of it, one just needs to look at those lowlands and valleys which are currently traversed by the Danube, Drava and Mura, together with their tributaries. This smaller Mediterranean at that time was not known to anybody, because this prehistoric Europe had not yet been inhabited by any human beings. There only existed masses of all kinds of animals, usually huge in size, of which one can still find remains in petrified condition today in some mountain caves or beneath sand and gravel deposits. But you should not be thinking that this small Mediterranean existed on its own, because especially in Europe, a lot of significantly large lakes existed, which were connected to this third Mediterranean by runoffs. The Crane, or its lowlands up to the deep upper Crane, was a by itself enclosed lake, of which the present-day so-called Ljubljana Marsh is a remnant, which, however, was linked with a strong outflow into the area of today's Ran and the second Mediterranean, which covered the vast lowlands of Croatia. A main part which was connected with the third Mediterranean stretched from the present-day Drava Valley up to the area of the sovereignty of Fall, and further on the narrow pass where the Drava River had to find a way through a long row of mountains up to the area of today's Ace, from where a fairly large lake began, of which the present-day so-called Werther Lake, or Werther Sea, is a remnant. Part of this lake extended up to the Drava Valley and far beyond Village, from where it was connected to still many smaller lakes. Thus today's Enns Valley was also a separate lake, which dug its way through the currently called Graz, and from there further on where it joined a much larger lake which covered the Danube Valley, and further upwards all lowlands of Bavaria and partly also the wide Inn Valley in Tyrol. Today's Mur, just like the Danube, had a shallow connection with the Third Mediterranean. The area of today's Waldens, up to the present-day Gosting, was covered by a small lake, and behind Gosting was another lake called Mur, covering the whole Mur surface and its flat side valleys, which in turn had smaller lakes in their background and thus were connected to the main lake via small outflows. Today's Switzerland had many similar small lakes of which remnants still exist nowadays. With that, you have a sufficient picture of the state of the pre-deluge mountains and the waters of this small part of the world. We now want to particularly take a look at Central Asia and its main mountains, which separates Central Asia from South Asia and which was the actual cradle of the Adamic human race. From the Ural, as already shown, a mountain range joined the High Tibet, which already at that stage was crisscrossed by many of the most fertile valleys, carrying rivers coming from the mountains and which had their main runoff to the north. These mountains was later inhabited during the times of Hanoch, and especially under the descendants of Seth, while the Hanochites lived in the lowlands and spread far beyond this mountain range. But when they saw that the inhabitants of the mountains were much better off than they themselves in their fertile and vast lowlands, they began to increasingly tease and pursue the inhabitants of the mountains. And despite many admonitions, they did not let go of the persecutions, but began by means of their explosive grains, of which today's Chinese powder is a descendant, to literally blow up and destroy these mountains by drilling deep holes in them. In their deepest blindness, they thereby not only provided an exit point for these large bodies of water, whose basins were sealed by these mountains, but also for those basins much further afield, covered by the Tibetan and Taurus mountains, and to the north for long stretches by the Ural. Thereby, particularly in the area of today's Caspian Sea, where once Hanoch stood, the largest immersion occurred, and the breakthrough of the waters was so powerful that it reached a height of between 7,000 and 8,000 feet above the other oceans, and was further increased and supported by a prolonged rainfall over the whole of Central Asia. This extraordinary high level of water in the whole of Central Asia found, to a large part, its outflow through today's Volga Valley, and increased this northern Mediterranean by many fathoms. The already weak land barrier at today's Constantinople, now Istanbul, was not able to withstand the subsequent forceful breakout, which was further supported by extraordinary, far-reaching, all-destructible fire eruptions occurring at the same time in that area. How high the waters of Central Asia have risen of their own accord is demonstrated by the fact that Noah and his box found a place on a plateau on Ararat, where the box remained. Most of the waters of this Central Asia then found their main outflow to the north and east, but an extremely significant part also to the south and west. As a result, the second great Mediterranean was so overfilled that, partly due to its weight, and to a large extent due to the subterranean fire eruptions, it made its way out into the Atlantic Ocean, and in a few hundred years it flowed so much that all the plains directly connected to it, some of which are currently very fertile, were largely drained, after which the coastal countries in particular could gradually be populated from Asia. But to a large extent this was accomplished by the peoples who were still alive in the high mountains of Asia, and also those of the Urals, which at that time was a fertile and broad stretch of land as far as the North Sea, from which the rest of the northern part of Europe was populated, especially in the mountains. The Taurisci also came from these people, who settled in the mountains of Styria and many other countries, and lived peacefully among themselves for a long time, until the Romans and Greeks' greed and imperialism discovered them. The land strip that connected Europe with Asia at the time of the Hanochite flood was named after the patriarch there, who belonged also to the mountain peoples and was a kind of prophet who travelled far across Western Asia, and was called Deucalion, that is, sent by God, or I come from God. And the flood was therefore also called the Deucalion flood by the peoples who lived in the South Asian part for a long time, until only after a few centuries the descendants of Noah revealed the main cause and the course of this flood with all its accompanying circumstances to them. In the course of many years, the then large lakes of Central Asia started to dry up, and unfortunately left behind until now still desolate and uninhabitable land. Only towards China and at the northern foot of the Tibetan high mountains is it fertile and habitable. From these parts originated the to you well-known Mongols, Huns, Tartars and Turkomans, who after the overpopulation of their land were forced to emigrate and turned partly to the east and partly to the west, where they caused these inhabitants great distress and harm everywhere. In the east, the ancient Sihonites, and in Japan, the Medjuhidites, felt the power and severity of the Mongols, and in the west, the Huns in particular, in conjunction with the Tartars, and later the Turkomans, made themselves very noticeable, and brought about the great migrations of peoples which occurred in those times, and which you are well aware of. In the present time, many attempts have been made to selectively turn the desert parts of Central Asia into fertile land. But the knowledge to make such desolate lands fertile is still too deeply buried in the night of their pagan superstition, and therefore this large stretch of land will have to wait for a very long time until it will arrive at its old pre-Noah fertility. How fertile the lands were at that time, including a large part of Siberia, is demonstrated by the mammoths and many other grass and leaf-eating animals that are still frequently found today, resting under the eternal snow and ice. They could no longer feed themselves after the destruction of this extremely fertile land, and thus became completely extinct long ago. In addition to the great mammoth, these include the giant deer, the giant sheep, the giant one-horned horse, and the like. some of which fossilized remains can still be found in the Ural Mountains and in large parts of the caves of northern Tibet, and also under the snow and ice of Siberia. Someone could easily ask why no remains of human bodies are found in Siberia. And the answer is, because the human body is much more ethereal in all its parts, and thus more decomposable from the very outset. That is, as far as the descendants of Adam are concerned. But as far as the pre-Adamite, so-called animal men, called Sephonisms, viewers of the firmament, are concerned, fossilized remains of them can still be found here and there, just as descendants of the type of animal men can still be found here and there, which are positioned between the descendants of Cain and the present-day apes, such as chimpanzees and orangutans. But of all animal species, they possessed the greatest instinctive intelligence, and here and there built their own dwellings, which were admittedly extremely monotonous, and also filled the not too wide parts of the streams and rivers with stones, thus building a kind of bridge over such places. And when the water began to flow over these bridges, which was usually the case, they soon built a second and higher one behind the old place where the current came from, and not infrequently continued this work until 10 or more such bridges were built in a crude terraced style, which in the end, however, were of little use to them, because the water behind them always began to swell and overflowed all these bridges again. The walls built by these people, who had a short tail covered with a thick tuft of hair, were those of which we can still find traces today, and which are said to be very old, far older than Adam, which is sometimes the case, as are some of these walls, especially in mountainous regions. But they are no more the work of a free human mind than is the very purposefully built houses of the beavers on the waters in which these animals find their abundant food. There are other species of animals on earth that build and arrange their homes in such a way that people themselves are extremely astonished when they find one. But these homes are nevertheless easily recognized as the work of animals, because they always occur in the same type and form. The material from which they are built can also be analysed by an experienced chemist to determine what it consists of. But the building material is just as little to be produced from nature as the material from which the spider spins its thread, the bee builds its cells, and the snail its house. And as is the case with such animals, the situation is not much better with the actual pre-Adamites that occur in the forests of Africa and here and there in the Americas. I think that I have shown you as briefly as possible the shape of the earth during the time of Adam more than sufficiently clear, and you will have no more questions about it. I just want to make 2 concluding remarks. The first is that the present Danube only made its way through the Iron Gate several hundred years later, although human hands had to be called upon to adjust the river's bed, which had long been very passable, through the Iron Gate to become navigable for larger vessels as it is now. To find out whether Mur lakes described above have created their enclosing obstacles, you only need to look at the hills surrounding the Mur bottom and the Meuse soil itself. And the rubble will tell you straight away how these hills came into being, as well as the current third bank formed by the Meuse. There you will easily find the remains of the embankments that were gradually destroyed. On the ground around Graz, you will easily find at a not very significant depth pebbles of quintal weight, and for the most part also of very hard consistency. Below Weldon, however, the Meuse was already less aggressive, only here and there, but already at a considerable depth, heavier, rolled limestones occur. And further down, below Radkersberg, up to where the Meuse flows into the Drava, you will find sand rather than rolled stones. And that is because the Meuse here already had a very wide bed, and thus lost its flow force due to a too shallow gradient. Go to Egypt, and you will find very little stone rubble up to the vicinity of the cataracts, but a much greater quantity of reddish-brown and sometimes whitish sand. The reason for this is that this river up to the region of the cataracts is still in a slightly different decline with the present Mediterranean Sea, as far as height is concerned, while other rivers have a steeper decline towards the sea, with the exception of the Danube into the Black Sea, the Volga into the Caspian Sea, and the Amazon River in America into the Atlantic Sea. Secondly, concerning the flooding of America, of which among the primordial inhabitants of this part of the world some dark legends exist, it serves, however, as no proof whatsoever for a general flooding, because at that time the lowlands of this part of the world were anyway still partly under water. Over time, this from north to south, sprawling part of the world was lifted more and more above the sea level by inner fire eruptions, and the sea was forced to gradually recede. There was also another natural event of great importance for this earth. In that primeval period of the earth, when, according to the law of sea migration, the greater part of the sea was located even more to the north, an unbroken line of islands extended from the extreme west coast of Africa to the eastern corner of what is now Brazil, thus dividing the northern sea of the Atlantic Ocean from the southern sea. And these two seas were only connected by a number of straits, the largest of which was hardly as wide as the Red Sea. But at that time, all parts of the world, especially the seabed, suffered many changes through underground fire force, and the aforementioned island series, as well as many thousands of large and small islands of the world's great oceans, sank into the deep seabed, and the North Atlantic could then flow unhindered through this wide gate into the South Atlantic. And in the northern parts of the earth, many islands and other lowlands emerged as usable land, and so also the lands of America. However, the tip of Africa, which once extended far down to the South Pole, is still under water. This is why the sea far below the Cape of Good Hope forms a kind of mountain, which ships find difficult to cross, especially in bad winds, and often have to make a long detour to reach the flat part of the Eastern Sea. It is, of course, much easier for modern-day steamers. There you then also have the flood of America, and for a lot of large and small islands. And do not research this message any further. Otherwise, I will have to lead you back into the primordial creation periods and many sea migrations. And you would not gain any more useful knowledge than an old woman who cannot understand how she came to have so many creases and wrinkles, despite having always lived good and chastely. And when still a girl of 20 years of age, for no price in the world, not one single wrinkle could be discovered on her whole body. Yes, here one cannot say anything else than, all this has been arranged by God the Lord, that times change, and we people, with everything that surrounds us, change with the times. Therefore, let us leave the earth in peace. In 1,000 years, it will already look completely different anyway. And therefore, good, and end with this explanation that I gave you, so that you can more easily understand some things in the Gospels and the writings of Moses. Amen.